Stede Bonnet. The gentleman pirate. The morning Stede Bonnet abandoned his sugar plantation to become a pirate. He packed his finest silk waistcoats alongside cutlasses he'd never wielded, as if respectability could somehow survive the salt spray and bloodshed of the Caribbean's most lawless waters. Major Stede Bonnet stood on the veranda of his Barbadian estate, watching the sun rise over endless fields of sugarcane that had made him one of the wealthiest planters on the island. The gentle trade winds carried the scent of molasses and prosperity, yet something gnawed at his soul like a festering wound. At 40 years old, he possessed everything a gentleman of breeding could desire: vast lands, countless slaves working his fields, a grand mansion filled with the finest European furnishings, and a wife who bore him children with dutiful regularity. Yet each dawn brought the same suffocating sense that his life was slowly strangling him with golden chains. The plantation stretched as far as the eye could see, a monument to colonial success built on the backs of human chattel and the dreams of men who had conquered paradise only to find it tasted of ash. Stede had inherited this legacy from his father, along with the expectations that came with bearing the Bonnet name. He was to be respectable, profitable, and utterly predictable, a pillar of Barbadian society who attended church on Sundays and counted his profits on Mondays. But respectability, Stede had discovered, was its own prison. The same conversations, at the same dinner parties, with the same tedious people, who spoke of nothing but crops and slaves and the latest gossip from London. His wife, Mary, had long since ceased to see him as anything more than a provider of comfort and status. Their marriage had become a business arrangement wrapped in the facade of Christian propriety, and their children barely knew him as anything more than a distant figure who emerged from his study to dispense brief paternal wisdom before retreating again into his books. For Stede Bonnet was, above all else, a reader. His study overflowed with volumes on history, philosophy, navigation, and most dangerously, adventure. He devoured accounts of buccaneers and privateers, of men who had thrown off the shackles of civilization to carve their own destinies from the raw stuff of wind and wave. While other planters discussed the price of sugar, Stede dreamed of horizons that promised something more than the endless repetition of seasons and harvests. The idea had been growing in his mind for months, perhaps years, taking root like some exotic seed that had blown in on the wind from distant shores. At first, it seemed merely the fantasy of a bored gentleman, the notion that he might simply walk away from everything he'd built, everything expected of him, to seek his fortune on the high seas. But as the days wore on and the weight of his predetermined life pressed down upon him like a lead shroud, the fantasy began to take on the solid shape of possibility. The morning he finally made his decision, Stede woke before dawn and walked through his house like a ghost, surveying the ruins of his former self. The portraits of stern ancestors watched him pass, their painted eyes seeming to register disapproval at the transformation brewing within their respectable descendant. In his study, leather-bound volumes of maritime law and navigation manuals lay open alongside maps of the Caribbean, marked with the routes of merchant vessels and the hidden harbors where pirates were said to gather. He had been planning in secret for weeks, using his contacts among the ship captains, who called at Barbados to purchase supplies and hire crew. The irony was not lost on him that his wealth built on the very system of commerce he now planned to prey upon would finance his rebellion against that same system. With careful discretion, he had commissioned the construction of a sloop, ostensibly for trading ventures. She was a beautiful vessel, 70 feet of sleek lines and graceful proportions, armed with 10 guns and designed for speed rather than cargo capacity. The Revenge, he had named her, though none but he knew the true meaning behind the choice. She was his revenge against a life of quiet desperation, his answer to years of suffocating respectability, his declaration that Stede Bonnet would no longer be content to wither away in the prison of other men's expectations. The ship waited for him now in Carlisle Bay, her crew assembled from the usual collection of sailors, rogues, and desperate men who asked no questions as long as their pay was good. As the household began to stir with the approaching dawn, Stede made his final preparations. He dressed carefully, as if preparing for an important social occasion rather than a complete break with civilization. His finest coat, his best breeches, his polished boots. If he was going to become a pirate, by God, he would do it as a gentleman. Into a sea chest went his most precious possessions. His books on navigation and seamanship, his collection of charts, his personal weapons, and a miniature portrait of his children. Not his wife, but his children, for whom he felt a pang of regret sharper than any cutlass blade. He left letters, of course, one for Mary, attempting to explain the inexplicable, though he knew she would never understand how a man could abandon security and respectability for the uncertain promise of adventure. Another for his overseer, containing detailed instructions for the management of the plantation in his absence, for even in rebellion, Stede Bonnet could not entirely shake the habits of methodical planning that had made him successful. A final letter, sealed and addressed to the governor, would be delivered only after his ship had sailed, formally announcing his intention to become a privateer in service of no nation but his own desires. The irony of his situation struck him as he made his way through the pre-dawn darkness toward Bridgetown Harbor. Here he was a wealthy planter about to become a pirate, yet he had never so much as fired a pistol in anger or wielded a sword, except in the genteel practice sessions that were part of a gentleman's education. His knowledge of seamanship came entirely from books, his understanding of piracy from romantic tales that likely bore little resemblance to the brutal reality he was about to embrace. Yet something deeper than rational thought drove him forward, some primal hunger for authentic experience that could no longer be denied. The crew of the Revenge greeted their captain with the careful deference that gold commands, though Stede could read the skepticism in their weathered faces. These were men who had served under captains forged in the crucible of battle, leaders who had earned their authority through blood and cunning rather than birthright and book learning. But they had been paid handsomely for their services. And in the pirates' democracy of the Caribbean, a man's coin spoke as loudly as his courage, at least until both were put to the test. Among his crew was Israel Hands, a grizzled veteran who had sailed with some of the most notorious pirates in the Caribbean. Hands had been recommended by a former buccaneer turned legitimate merchant, who had assured Stede that the old salt knew these waters better than any man alive. What the merchant had not mentioned was Hands' reputation for brutality, or his barely concealed contempt for any captain who had not earned his position through violence and cunning. As the Revenge slipped her moorings and caught the morning wind, Stede felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror unlike anything he had ever experienced. Behind him, Barbados grew smaller with each passing moment, taking with it everything he had been and everything he was expected to become. Ahead lay the vast blue expanse of the Caribbean, promising adventure, wealth, freedom, and quite possibly death. For the first time in his adult life, Major Stede Bonnet had no idea what tomorrow would bring, and the uncertainty was both thrilling and terrifying. The first weeks at sea revealed the enormous gap between Stede's romantic notions of piracy and its harsh reality. His crew, while respectful enough when addressing him directly, made their doubts about his leadership increasingly clear through glances, whispered conversations, and barely concealed smirks. When he attempted to give orders using the formal language of his gentleman's education, pirates, he quickly learned, had their own vocabulary, their own customs, and their own brutal logic that bore little resemblance to the naval procedures he had memorized from his books. His first attempt at taking a prize ended in embarrassing failure. They had spotted a merchant vessel off the coast of Martinique, a fat Spanish galleon heavy with goods and sailing without escort. In his study at home, Stede had imagined such encounters as gentlemanly affairs, a polite demand for surrender, perhaps a brief exchange of cannon fire for form's sake, followed by the civilized transfer of cargo from the defeated vessel to his own holds. The reality proved far more chaotic and violent than his books had prepared him for. The Spanish captain, rather than surrendering meekly, as Stede had expected, chose to fight. Cannons roared across the narrow stretch of water between the ships, filling the air with smoke and splinters of wood. Men screamed and died in ways that Stede's sheltered life had never prepared him to witness. The deck of the Revenge became slick with blood, and the genteel captain found himself frozen with shock as his crew fought with a savage intensity that belonged to a different world entirely. It was Israel Hands who saved the day, taking effective command of the ship, while Stede stood paralyzed by the reality of violence. The old pirate barked orders that the crew obeyed without question, maneuvering the Revenge with practiced skill to bring their guns to bear on the Spanish vessel as weakest points. When the enemy finally struck their colors in surrender, it was Hands who led the boarding party and organized the systematic looting of their prize. The aftermath was even more shocking to Stede's civilized sensibilities. Several Spanish sailors had died in the fighting, their bodies now floating in the churning water between the two ships. Others were wounded, crying out in pain and fear as the pirates searched them for valuables. The captain of the Spanish vessel, a dignified man who reminded Stede uncomfortably of himself, stood with quiet dignity as his possessions were rifled through and his cargo transferred to the pirates' holds. That evening, as the Revenge sailed away from their first successful capture, Stede retreated to his cabin and tried to reconcile what he had witnessed with his romantic dreams of piracy. The gold and silver now filling his ship's hold represented more wealth than most men would see in a lifetime. Yet it had been purchased with blood and terror. The Spanish sailors who had died that day had been little different from his own crew, men trying to make their living on the dangerous waters of the Caribbean. The difference was that they had chosen the wrong ship to sail on, the wrong route to take, the wrong day to encounter the gentleman pirate who was still learning the true cost of his rebellion against respectability. But there was no turning back now. Word of their capture would spread quickly through the Caribbean, and every colonial authority from Barbados to Jamaica would soon be looking for the renegade planter who had turned pirate. Governor Laws of the Bahamas had already issued a proclamation offering amnesty to pirates who surrendered, but Stede knew that his case was different. He was not some desperate sailor driven to piracy by poverty or circumstance. He was a wealthy gentleman who had chosen this path freely, making him a far more dangerous example to others who might be tempted to follow his lead. The crew's attitude toward him began to change after their first successful capture. The gold in their pockets bought a measure of respect that his gentleman's education had failed to earn, and Israel Hand's obvious expertise had demonstrated that competent leadership existed aboard the Revenge, even if it did not come from the captain's cabin. Stede found himself increasingly marginalized from the actual command of his own vessel, relegated to the ceremonial role of figurehead, while Hands made the real decisions about where to sail and what ships to attack. This arrangement might have continued indefinitely, with Stede content to play the role of wealthy patron to a crew of professional pirates, had they not encountered Edward Teach in the waters off the North Carolina coast. The meeting would change everything for the gentleman pirate, introducing him to a man who embodied everything that piracy could be when practiced by someone who understood its true nature. Blackbeard's reputation preceded him, like the sulphurous smoke of the slow-burning hemp he wove into his magnificent beard. Even Israel Hands, who feared nothing that sailed the Caribbean, spoke of Edward Teach with a mixture of respect and terror that bordered on religious awe. When the Queen Anne's Revenge appeared on the horizon, flying the black flag that struck fear into the hearts of merchants throughout the American colonies, Stede's crew gathered at the rail to watch the approach of the most notorious pirate captain in the New World. The Queen Anne's Revenge was a sight to behold. A massive frigate, bristling with 40 guns and crowded with the most dangerous collection of cutthroats ever assembled under a single banner. As she drew alongside the smaller Revenge, her crew lined the rails like devils from some maritime hell, their faces painted with the scars and tattoos that marked them as veterans of countless battles. At their head stood Blackbeard himself, a giant of a man whose very presence seemed to darken the Caribbean sun. Edward Teach was everything that Stede Bonnet was not, a natural leader forged by violence and hardship, a man who commanded through fear and respect earned in the crucible of combat. Where Stede was educated and refined, Blackbeard was instinctive and brutal. Where the gentleman pirate relied on books and theory, the devil's admiral trusted in powder and shot. Yet, when they met face to face on the deck of the Revenge, something unexpected passed between them. A recognition of kindred spirits, who had chosen to reject the conventional world, albeit for very different reasons. Blackbeard's initial intention had been simple enough: to rob the gentleman pirate and send him back to Barbados with his tail between his legs, a lesson to other wealthy colonists who might be tempted to play at piracy. But something about Stede intrigued him, perhaps the very incongruity of a refined planter turned pirate, or maybe the recognition of a fellow rebel against the suffocating conventions of colonial society. Instead of taking the Revenge as a prize, Blackbeard proposed something unprecedented: a partnership between the two captains. The terms of their alliance were unlike anything in the loose confederation of Caribbean pirates. Stede would retain nominal command of his vessel and crew, but both ships would operate under Blackbeard's overall strategic leadership. The gentleman pirate's wealth and connections would provide resources and intelligence about merchant shipping, while Blackbeard's experience and fearsome reputation would ensure their continued success in capturing prizes. It was, in essence, a marriage between respectability and savagery, civilization and chaos. For Stede, the partnership offered everything he had been seeking: authentic adventure under the guidance of a man who truly understood the pirate's trade. Blackbeard represented the dark romance of piracy made flesh, a figure who had stepped out of the very adventure stories that had first inspired Stede's rebellion. Under his tutelage, perhaps the gentleman pirate could finally become the fearsome captain he had imagined himself to be. The reality of sailing with Blackbeard proved to be an education in violence unlike anything Stede's privileged background had prepared him for. Edward Teach was a master of psychological warfare, using his terrifying appearance and theatrical cruelty to break the will of his enemies before battle was even joined. He would appear on the deck of a prize vessel like some demon from the depths, his beard wreathed in smoke from the slow burning hemp, his eyes wild with manufactured madness, his weapons gleaming with the promise of swift death to any who dared resist. Yet Stede gradually came to understand that much of Blackbeard's fearsome reputation was carefully crafted theater. The man behind the legend was far more intelligent and calculating than his savage image suggested. A master strategist who understood that a reputation for uncontrollable violence often eliminated the need for actual violence. Ships would surrender at the mere sight of his black flag, their crews paralyzed by terror before a single shot was fired. The death and destruction that followed were often less than what would have resulted from prolonged resistance. A brutal calculation that served both Blackbeard's tactical needs and his crew's survival. Under Blackbeard's guidance, Stede began to learn the true arts of piracy. He discovered how to read the wind and currents to anticipate a merchant ship's course, how to approach from the sun to blind lookouts, how to use the Revenge's superior speed to cut off escape routes. More importantly, he learned the psychology of command, how to project authority even when he felt uncertain, how to inspire fear in enemies while maintaining loyalty among his crew, how to make the split-second decisions that could mean the difference between wealth and death. Their partnership proved remarkably successful. In the months that followed their alliance, the combined fleet of Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet captured more than 40 vessels, accumulating a treasure that made them two of the wealthiest men in the Americas. From their base in the hidden harbors of the North Carolina coast, they controlled shipping lanes that carried the lifeblood of colonial commerce, taking what they pleased and leaving behind a trail of empty ships and terrified survivors to spread word of their But success brought its own dangers. The colonial authorities, initially content to treat piracy as a minor nuisance, now recognized the threat that Blackbeard's confederation posed to the economic foundation of their society. Royal Navy ships began to patrol the Caribbean in unprecedented numbers, while colonial governors offered bounties that attracted fortune hunters from across the Atlantic. The golden age of piracy was beginning to wane, and men like Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet found themselves increasingly hunted by forces that possessed both the resources and the motivation to end their predations permanently. The first sign that their luck was changing came when they attempted to blockade the port of Charleston, South Carolina. It was a bold move, perhaps too bold, designed to demonstrate that no colonial authority could stand against the combined might of their fleet. For nearly a week, they held the harbor hostage, capturing every vessel that attempted to enter or leave, and effectively shutting down one of the most important commercial ports in the American colonies. The blockade might have continued indefinitely had Blackbeard not decided to demand a ransom that pushed colonial patience beyond its breaking point. Rather than simply gold or supplies, he demanded a chest of medical supplies for his crew, many of whom were suffering from tropical diseases contracted during their months at sea. The request was reasonable enough, but the manner of its delivery, through hostages taken from a captured passenger vessel, struck the Charleston authorities as intolerable arrogance. Governor Robert Johnson of South Carolina responded by dispatching every available warship to break the blockade, while simultaneously appealing to London for additional naval support. The pirates found themselves facing organized resistance on a scale they had never encountered before, with colonial authorities finally willing to pay the cost necessary to eliminate the threat they represented. The age of easy prizes and half-hearted pursuit was coming to an end. Blackbeard, with his instinct for survival honed by years of violence, recognized the changing tide before his partner did. The Devil's Admiral had built his success on knowing when to fight and when to run, and every instinct told him that the time for running had arrived. But Stede, intoxicated by months of success and the transformation he had undergone from respectable planter to feared pirate captain, was reluctant to abandon the life he had worked so hard to create. Their disagreement came to a head during a council of war held on a remote beach in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Blackbeard argued for dispersing their fleet and seeking the amnesty that Governor Eden of North Carolina was quietly offering to pirates who abandoned their trade. Stede, supported by some of the younger and more ambitious members of their crew, pushed for continuing their operations despite the increased danger. The gentleman pirate had finally found his authentic self in the smoke and blood of piracy, and he was not ready to return to the suffocating respectability he had fought so hard to escape. The debate revealed fundamental differences in their approaches to piracy that had been masked by their mutual success. Blackbeard was, at heart, a pragmatist who used violence as a tool to achieve specific goals: wealth, power, and the freedom to live outside conventional society's constraints. But Stede had discovered something deeper in piracy, a form of existential rebellion that gave meaning to his entire existence. For him, returning to respectability would be a kind of death, the surrender of everything he had fought to become. In the end, they agreed to disagree, and their partnership dissolved as amicably as such things could in the violent world they inhabited. Blackbeard would pursue his negotiations with Governor Eden, eventually accepting amnesty and attempting to retire to a life of quiet prosperity in North Carolina. Stede would continue his piratical career, taking command of both vessels and striking out on his own to prove that the gentleman pirate could succeed without the Devil's Admiral's protection. The separation marked the beginning of the end for both men, though neither could have predicted the forms their destruction would take. Blackbeard's attempt at retirement would end in betrayal and death, cut down by Lieutenant Maynard's men in Ocracoke Inlet, after Governor Spotswood of Virginia decided that the former pirate's continued existence posed an unacceptable threat to colonial security. Stede's independent career would prove brief and tragic, a final act that demonstrated both the courage and the fatal naivety that had characterized his entire transformation from planter to pirate. Alone for the first time since becoming a pirate, Stede found himself facing challenges that Blackbeard's presence had previously shielded him from. His crew, no longer awed by their association with the notorious Edward Teach, began to question their captain's decisions more openly. Israel Hands, in particular, made no secret of his belief that the gentleman pirate lacked the ruthlessness necessary to succeed in their dangerous trade. The delicate balance of respect and fear that maintained discipline aboard a pirate vessel required constant reinforcement through successful captures and decisive leadership, neither of which came naturally to a man raised in the drawing rooms of Barbadian society. Stede's first independent cruise took him along the coast of Delaware and New Jersey, waters that had been relatively safe from piracy, but were now seeing increased colonial patrols in response to the growing threat. His knowledge of these northern waters was limited, and without Blackbeard's intelligence network, he had difficulty identifying suitable targets. The few merchant vessels they did encounter were either too well armed to take safely or too poor to be worth the risk. Their luck finally changed when they spotted a small sloop carrying trade goods between Philadelphia and New York. The vessel appeared lightly armed and heavily loaded, exactly the kind of easy prize that had filled their holds during the halcyon days of their partnership with Blackbeard. But appearances proved deceiving, and what should have been a simple capture turned into a running battle that lasted the better part of a day. The merchant captain proved to be a former naval officer who knew how to fight, and his crew included several men who had served in the Royal Navy during the recent war with Spain. Instead of striking their colors at the first sight of the pirate flag, they returned fire with a competence that surprised Stede's crew and inflicted serious casualties on the attackers. By the time the Revenge finally overwhelmed their resistance, 3 of Stede's men were dead and several others wounded. A heavy price for a cargo that proved to be worth far less than they had hoped. The aftermath of the battle revealed the growing tensions within Stede's crew. The men who had died were popular veterans whose loss was deeply felt, and many of their shipmates began to question whether their captain's leadership was worth the blood it was costing them. Mutinous talk spread through the ship like a fever, and Stede found himself facing the first serious challenge to his authority since taking command of the Revenge. The crisis came to a head when Israel Hands openly challenged Stede's competence. During a heated discussion about their next move, the old pirate argued that they should abandon their current cruise and seek easier hunting grounds in the Caribbean, where colonial defenses were weaker and potential prizes more numerous. Stede, stung by the implied criticism of his leadership, insisted on continuing their operations in American waters, where his knowledge of colonial commerce gave them certain advantages. The confrontation that followed was inevitable, though Stede had dreaded it since their first days at sea. In the democratic society of a pirate crew, disputes between captain and crew were traditionally settled by combat, with leadership going to whoever proved stronger or more ruthless. Hands, confident in his superior experience and reputation for violence, called for a formal challenge that would determine who would command the Revenge. What followed was perhaps the most important moment of Stede's piratical career. The test that would either confirm his right to leadership or expose him as the dilettante that many of his crew believed him to be. Standing on the deck of his ship, with the Caribbean sun beating down on his silk waistcoat and the eyes of his crew fixed upon him, the gentleman pirate faced the choice between the violence that piracy demanded and the civilized restraint that his upbringing had instilled in him. The duel itself was brief and savage, fought with cutlass and dagger, according to the ancient traditions of the Brotherhood of the Coast. Israel's Hands was a veteran of countless such encounters, his body scarred by decades of violence, and his movements honed by years of survival in the most dangerous waters of the world. Stede was an educated gentleman whose knowledge of swordplay came primarily from the formal lessons that were part of any proper upbringing, supplemented by frantic practice sessions since becoming a pirate. By all logic, the outcome should have been predetermined. Hands possessed every advantage except one. He underestimated the desperate fury of a man fighting not just for his life, but for the meaning he had finally found in that life. When the smoke cleared and the blood was wiped from the deck, it was Stede Bonnet who stood victorious, his fine clothes torn and bloodied, but his authority as captain finally confirmed in the only way that mattered to his crew. The death of Israel Hands marked a turning point in Stede's development as a pirate captain. The gentleman, who had once been paralyzed by the sight of violence, had proven himself capable of dealing death when necessary, earning the grudging respect of men who measured worth primarily through courage and ruthlessness. But the victory came at a cost that went beyond the blood on his hands, something essential to his civilized, Nature had been sacrificed on the altar of piratical necessity. In the months that followed, Stede's crew noticed changes in their captain that reflected his gradual transformation from gentleman amateur to professional pirate. His orders became sharper and more decisive. His treatment of prisoners less concerned with the niceties of civilized warfare. His approach to command more ruthless and pragmatic. The books that had once filled his cabin gave way to charts and weapons, while his fine clothing was gradually replaced by the practical garb of a working sea captain. Yet, even as he adapted to the demands of his chosen profession, Stede never entirely lost the qualities that had set him apart from other pirate captains. He continued to treat captured passengers with a courtesy that surprised them, often going out of his way to ensure that women and children were not harmed during raids. His crew, while no longer questioning his courage, sometimes grumbled about his reluctance to embrace the casual brutality that many pirates considered essential to maintaining their fearsome reputation. These contradictions in his character would ultimately contribute to his downfall, creating opportunities for his enemies while limiting his ability to inspire the kind of fanatical loyalty that had protected captains like Blackbeard. Stede Bonnet remained, at heart, a gentleman playing at piracy rather than a true predator of the seas. And in a world where weakness invited destruction, such half measures were often fatal. The beginning of the end came when colonial authorities finally coordinated their efforts to eliminate the pirate threat once and for all. Governor Johnson of South Carolina, emboldened by his success in breaking the Charleston blockade, convinced his fellow governors to pool their resources for a comprehensive campaign against the remaining pirate strongholds. Royal Navy vessels were assigned to patrol key shipping lanes, while colonial militias were organized to attack pirate bases on land. Stede, operating independently and without reliable intelligence about these coordinated efforts, sailed directly into the trap that was being prepared for him. His decision to return to waters near Charleston, perhaps motivated by a desire to prove that he could succeed where he and Blackbeard had previously triumphed together, put him directly in the path of the largest anti-piracy operation ever mounted by the American colonies. Colonel William Rhett, commanding a small fleet of South Carolina vessels, had been specifically tasked with hunting down and capturing Stede Bonnet. Rhett was a competent naval officer who had studied the gentleman pirates as previous operations and developed tactics specifically designed to counter his methods. Unlike the merchant captains who had previously fallen victim to Stede's raids, Rhett understood both the strengths and weaknesses of pirate warfare. The trap was sprung near the mouth of the Cape Fear River in North Carolina, where Stede had taken his ships for repairs after a successful cruise against Virginia shipping. Rhett's vessels, disguised as merchant ships until the last possible moment, caught the pirates at their most vulnerable, anchored in shallow water with much of their crew ashore, gathering supplies and careening their vessels. The Battle of Cape Fear River became the final test of everything Stede had learned during his transformation from gentleman planter to pirate captain. For 5 hours, the opposing forces exchanged cannon fire across the narrow waters of the river mouth, while both sides maneuvered for advantage in the treacherous currents and shifting sandbars that made the Cape Fear one of the most dangerous harbors on the American coast. Stede's seamanship, honed by months of experience under Blackbeard's tutelage, served him well in the early stages of the battle. He used his superior knowledge of the Revenge's handling characteristics to maintain a position that allowed his guns to rake the South Carolina vessels while limiting their ability to return effective fire. For a time, it seemed that the gentleman pirate might achieve the kind of spectacular victory that would secure his legend among the Brotherhood of the Coast. But ultimately, numbers and preparation told. Rhett had brought more ships and more guns than Stede could effectively counter, while the colonial crews were better disciplined and more familiar with these particular waters. As the battle wore on and casualties mounted, it became clear that the pirates were fighting a losing battle against opponents who had learned from previous encounters with their kind. The end came suddenly, as endings often do in naval warfare. A lucky shot from one of Rhett's vessels brought down the Revenge's mainmast, leaving Stede's ship unable to maneuver effectively in the tricky currents of the Cape Fear. Within minutes, the South Carolina vessels had closed to point-blank range, their guns raking the pirate ship with devastating effect. Faced with the choice between certain destruction and surrender, Stede Bonnet made the decision that would define the final chapter of his remarkable life. Rather than fight to the death, as many pirate captains would have done, he struck his colors and surrendered his ship, hoping that his status as a gentleman might earn him treatment different from that accorded to common pirates. The decision to surrender, rather than die fighting, would be seen by many as the final proof that Stede Bonnet had never truly understood the pirate code that valued death before dishonor. But perhaps it represented something else entirely. The last vestige of the civilized man who had once believed that reason and respectability could coexist with rebellion and adventure, even in defeat. The gentleman pirate could not entirely abandon the hope that his educated background might somehow provide an escape from the consequences of his chosen path. His capture marked the end of one of the most unusual careers in the annals of piracy, but it was not the end of Stede Bonnet's story. The man who had abandoned his plantation to seek authentic adventure would face his greatest test, not on the deck of a ship with a cutlass in his hand, but in the dock of a Charleston courtroom, where his life would be weighed against the demands of colonial justice. The trial of Stede Bonnet became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in colonial American history, attracting attention from London to the Caribbean, as observers waited to see how the authorities would deal with a pirate who was also a gentleman. Never before had someone of Stede's social standing and education been charged with piracy, creating legal and political complications that went far beyond the simple question of his guilt or innocence. Governor Johnson and his advisors understood that they were setting an important precedent. If Stede were treated leniently because of his social status, it would send a message that piracy was acceptable for those wealthy enough to pursue it as a gentleman's adventure. But if he were treated exactly like any common pirate, it might create sympathy for a man who was seen by many colonists as a romantic figure rather than a dangerous criminal. The prosecution's case was straightforward enough. They had abundant evidence of Stede's piratical activities, including testimony from captured merchants, members of his own crew, who had agreed to testify in exchange for clemency and documentation of the vessels he had taken during his career. His identity as the gentleman pirate was well established, and there could be no question that he had committed the acts of piracy with which he was charged. But Stede's defense, conducted by lawyers hired with what remained of his considerable wealth, took an approach that had never been attempted before in a piracy trial. Rather than denying his client's actions, they argued that his mental state at the time of his crimes should be taken into consideration. They painted a picture of a man driven to temporary madness by the pressures of colonial life, a respected member of society who had suffered what they termed a disorder of the mind that had led him to abandon everything he held dear for the illusory freedom of piracy. The defense strategy was revolutionary in its implications, suggesting for the first time that piracy might be understood as a form of mental illness rather than simple criminality. Stede himself proved to be an articulate witness on his own behalf, describing the suffocating sense of predestination that had driven him from his plantation to the sea. His testimony revealed a man of intelligence and education who had been genuinely tormented by the constraints of colonial society, lending credence to his lawyer's argument that his actions had been those of a man not entirely in control of his faculties. The courtroom was packed throughout the trial, with spectators drawn by the unprecedented nature of the proceedings. Charleston society, from the wealthiest merchants to the humblest laborers, followed every detail of the testimony as if it were entertainment rather than a matter of life and death. The gentleman pirate had become a celebrity, his story touching something in the colonial imagination that went beyond simple fascination with crime and punishment. Among the spectators were many who had known Stede during his days as a respectable planter, men who had dined at his table and discussed business in his parlor. Their testimony painted a picture of a man who had shown no signs of the violent tendencies that had later characterized his piratical career, supporting the defense argument that his transformation had been the result of some fundamental disorder of his mental faculties. But the prosecution had witnesses of their own. Survivors of Stede's raids who testified to the terror and violence that had accompanied his attacks on their vessels. While they acknowledged that the gentleman pirate had often shown unusual courtesy to passengers and had sometimes spared lives that other pirates would have taken without thought, they made clear that his operations had nonetheless resulted in death and destruction on a considerable scale. The testimony that perhaps damaged Stede's case most severely came from former members of his own crew. Men who had served under him during his partnership with Blackbeard and his subsequent independent operations. These witnesses described the captain who had gradually become more ruthless and calculating as his career progressed, contradicting the defense's portrayal of a man driven by temporary madness to acts he would never have contemplated in his right mind. Most damaging of all was the testimony regarding his duel with Israel Hands, which demonstrated that Stede had been capable of deliberate, calculated violence when his authority was challenged. The prosecution argued that this incident proved beyond doubt that the defendant was a man in full control of his faculties, who had chosen piracy not because of mental disorder, but because of a deliberate rejection of the moral constraints that govern civilized society. The trial lasted for weeks, with testimony that revealed not only the details of Stede's crimes, but also the broader social and economic forces that had shaped colonial society. The gentleman pirate's story became a lens through which observers could examine the tensions between individual desire and social expectation, between the promises of the New World and the constraints of Old World respectability, between the romantic appeal of freedom and the harsh realities of lawless violence. Judge Nicholas Trott, presiding over the proceedings, faced a decision that would establish important precedents for how colonial justice would deal with crimes that crossed traditional social boundaries. The law was clear enough regarding piracy. It was a capital offense, punishable by death, regardless of the social status of the perpetrator. But the unprecedented nature of Stede's case, combined with the political implications of his conviction, made the judge's task far more complex than a simple application of existing statutes. In his final address to the court, Stede Bonnet delivered what many observers considered one of the most eloquent defenses ever heard in a colonial courtroom, speaking without notes and with the dignity that his upbringing had instilled in him. He acknowledged his crimes while attempting to explain the forces that had driven him to commit them. He spoke of the suffocating predictability of plantation life, the sense that his existence had been predetermined by circumstances beyond his control, and the desperate hunger for authentic experience that had led him to abandon everything he had built for the uncertain promise of adventure on the high seas. His words revealed a man of genuine intelligence and education, who had struggled with questions that went to the heart of colonial existence. What was the meaning of a life lived entirely according to other people's expectations? How could a man find authentic purpose in a world that seemed to offer only the endless repetition of predetermined roles? These were not the ravings of a madman, but the thoughtful reflections of someone who had grappled seriously with fundamental questions about the nature of human existence and the price of civilization. Yet, for all his eloquence, Stede could not escape the fundamental facts of his case. He had chosen to become a pirate, had commanded vessels that attacked and robbed innocent merchants, had presided over acts of violence that had resulted in death and suffering for people whose only crime had been sailing in waters that he had claimed for his own predatory purposes. Whatever philosophical justifications he might offer for his actions, the law recognized only the simple facts of his crimes and their consequences. Judge Trott's verdict surprised no one who had followed the trial closely. Stede Bonnet was found guilty of piracy on multiple counts and sentenced to death by hanging, the traditional punishment for his crimes. But the judge's sentencing remarks revealed the complex considerations that had influenced his decision, acknowledging both the defendant's unusual background and the necessity of upholding the law without regard to social status or personal circumstances. The sentence marked the end of Stede's hopes for legal salvation. But it was not the end of his story. Colonial society had been deeply divided by his trial, with many people genuinely sympathetic to a man who seemed to embody their own frustrations with the constraints of respectable life. Petitions for clemency circulated throughout South Carolina and beyond, signed by merchants, planters, and ordinary citizens who saw in the gentleman pirate's fate a reflection of their own unfulfilled dreams of freedom and adventure. Governor Johnson found himself under considerable pressure to commute Stede's sentence, both from influential members of colonial society who had known the defendant during his respectable days, and from ordinary people who had been moved by his story. The political implications of the case extended far beyond South Carolina, with observers in other colonies watching to see how the authorities would balance the demands of justice against the claims of mercy and social status. But Johnson was a practical politician who understood the broader implications of his decision to show mercy to Stede Bonnet, regardless of the popular sympathy for his plight, would send a message that piracy was acceptable for those wealthy and educated enough to pursue it as a gentleman's adventure. Such a precedent would undermine everything the colonial authorities had been trying to accomplish in their campaign against piracy, potentially encouraging others to follow Stede's example. Moreover, the governor was under pressure from London to demonstrate that colonial justice was capable of dealing firmly with threats to imperial commerce. The Crown had invested considerable resources in suppressing piracy throughout the Caribbean and American waters, and any sign of weakness or favoritism would be seen as evidence that colonial authorities could not be trusted to protect British commercial interests. In his final weeks before the scheduled execution, Stede was allowed visitors in his Charleston prison cell, creating opportunities for the kind of dramatic encounters that would later be embellished by storytellers and historians. His wife Mary made the difficult journey from Barbados, accompanied by their children, for a final meeting that was said to have moved even his jailers to tears. The woman who had lived for years with a husband she barely understood finally came face to face with the man he had become, and their conversation revealed the enormous gulf that had opened between them during his transformation from planter to pirate. Mary could not comprehend how the methodical, responsible man she had married could have abandoned everything they had built together for the violent uncertainty of piracy. For her, his actions represented not a quest for authentic experience, but a betrayal of everything she had believed about their life together. She had come to Charleston hoping to take her husband home, to somehow return to the life they had shared before his inexplicable rebellion against respectability. But the man she found in that prison cell was no longer the Stede Bonnet she had married. The months at sea, the violence he had witnessed and participated in, the constant proximity of death, and the intoxicating taste of absolute freedom had changed him in ways that made a return to plantation life impossible. Even facing execution, he could not bring himself to regret the choice that had led him to this fate, though he deeply regretted the pain his decisions had caused to those he had left behind. Their final conversation was said to have lasted for hours, ranging over the entire course of their marriage and the forces that had driven him to abandon it. Mary left Charleston with a deeper understanding of the man she had married, but also with the knowledge that the gulf between them could never be bridged. The gentleman pirate had found something in his rebellion that he valued more than life itself, and she could not compete with such powerful attractions. Other visitors came as well, former business associates who had known Stede during his respectable days, fellow planters who saw in his fate a warning about the dangers of straying too far from conventional paths, and curious members of Charleston society who wanted to meet the man who had become such a celebrated figure. Each encounter revealed different aspects of his character and the complex motivations that had driven his transformation from wealthy planter to notorious pirate. Perhaps the most significant visitor was a young lawyer named Charles Eden, nephew of the North Carolina governor, who had offered amnesty to pirates willing to abandon their trade. The younger Eden had followed Stede's trial closely and had become convinced that the condemned man represented something more than a simple criminal deserving of execution. He saw in the gentleman pirate's story a reflection of the broader tensions that were beginning to tear at the fabric of colonial society. forces that would eventually lead to revolution and the birth of a new nation. Eden's conversations with Stede in those final weeks revealed a man who had thought deeply about the nature of freedom and the price that individuals must pay to live authentically in a world that demanded conformity. The gentleman pirate spoke eloquently about the suffocating nature of predetermined existence, the way that colonial society seemed designed to channel every individual into roles that served the empire's economic interests, while leaving no room for personal fulfillment or genuine choice. These philosophical discussions took on added poignancy given the circumstances under which they occurred. Here was a man facing imminent death for his attempts to break free from social constraints. Yet he seemed more alive and authentic than he had ever been during his years as a respectable planter. The contradiction highlighted the complex relationship between freedom and responsibility, between individual desire and social necessity, that lay at the heart of colonial existence. As the date set for his execution approached, Stede spent increasing amounts of time writing what he intended as a final statement to be read after his death. The document, which survived and provides crucial insight into his state of mind during those final weeks, revealed a man who had achieved a kind of peace with his choices, despite their ultimate consequences. He wrote of the authentic experiences he had found in piracy, the genuine camaraderie he had discovered among his crew, and the intoxicating sense of freedom that had come from living entirely according to his own will rather than society's expectations. But he also acknowledged the terrible price that his rebellion had exacted, not only from himself, but from the innocent people who had suffered as a result of his actions. The merchant sailors who had died in battles with his ships, the passengers who had been terrorized during his raids, the families who had been separated by his depredations. All of these weighed heavily on his conscience as he prepared to face whatever judgment awaited him beyond death. The execution was scheduled for December 10, 1718, at White Point in Charleston Harbor, the traditional site for pirate hangings. The location was chosen deliberately, offering a clear view of the shipping lanes, where Stede had once hunted for prizes, and serving as a warning to any other potential pirates who might be considering following his example. The symbolism was powerful. The gentleman pirate would die in sight of the waters, where he had found the freedom that had eluded him on land. Word of the impending execution spread throughout the colonies and beyond, drawing spectators from as far away as New York and the Caribbean islands. The sight of a gentleman facing the pirate's traditional death had attracted morbid curiosity from people who had never seen such a spectacle, while others came out of genuine sympathy for a man whose story had touched something deep in the colonial imagination. The crowd that gathered on that December morning included representatives of every level of colonial society, from wealthy merchants and planters who had come to witness the fate of someone who had abandoned their world, to ordinary sailors and laborers who saw in Stede Bonnet's story a reflection of their own dreams of escape from predetermined lives. The diversity of the audience reflected the broad impact that the gentleman pirate's story had made on colonial consciousness. Governor Johnson attended personally, along with other colonial officials who wanted to demonstrate that justice applied equally to all social classes. Their presence was intended to emphasize that no one, regardless of wealth or education or social standing, was above the law when it came to crimes against the crown and colonial commerce. The message was clear. Piracy would not be tolerated, even when practiced by those who might otherwise be considered pillars of society. Stede himself appeared at the scaffold, dressed in the finest clothes that his remaining wealth could purchase, maintaining the dignity that had characterized his bearing throughout his trial and imprisonment. Even facing death, he could not entirely abandon the habits of dress and deportment that marked him as a gentleman, creating a striking contrast with the rough hemp rope and crude wooden platform that awaited him. His final speech from the scaffold became one of the most famous addresses in the annals of colonial crime, combining eloquent acknowledgement of his crimes with a passionate defense of the principles that had driven him to commit them. He spoke of the deadening effect of predetermined existence, the way that colonial society seemed designed to crush individual will beneath the weight of economic necessity and social expectation. He acknowledged the pain his choices had caused to innocent people, while maintaining that his rebellion against respectability had been necessary for his own spiritual survival. The crowd listened in respectful silence as he spoke, many of them moved by the dignity and intelligence he displayed even in his final moments. Here was no common criminal facing justice, but a man who had grappled seriously with fundamental questions about the nature of human existence and the price of authentic living. His words revealed the philosophical depth that had always set him apart from other pirate captains, even as they confirmed his acceptance of the consequences that his choices had brought upon him. When the moment came, Stede Bonnet faced his death with the same courage that had sustained him through his transformation from gentleman planter to notorious pirate. The rope was adjusted around his neck by executioners who had performed this grim duty many times before. Yet even they seemed affected by the unusual dignity of this particular condemned man. As the trapdoor opened and the gentleman pirate dropped to his death, those present witnessed the end of one of the most remarkable careers in the history of American piracy. But death did not end Stede Bonnet's influence on colonial consciousness. In the years that followed his execution, his story became part of the folklore of the American colonies, inspiring countless retellings that emphasized different aspects of his character and motivations. To some, he became a romantic figure who had died for the principle of individual freedom, a martyr to the cause of authentic living in a world that demanded conformity. To others, he remained a cautionary tale about the dangers of abandoning responsibility and respectability for the illusory attractions of lawless adventure. The gentleman pirate's legacy extended far beyond the immediate impact of his crimes and punishment. His story highlighted tensions within colonial society that would continue to grow in the decades following his death, eventually contributing to the revolutionary sentiment that would lead to American independence. The questions he had raised about the nature of freedom and the individual's relationship to established authority resonated with colonists who were beginning to chafe under imperial control and to imagine alternative forms of social organization. Moreover, his example demonstrated that piracy was not simply the resort of desperate men driven to crime by poverty and circumstances, but could also attract individuals who possessed other options. The fact that someone of Stede's wealth and education had chosen piracy as a form of rebellion suggested that the phenomenon had deeper roots than colonial authorities had previously understood. It was not enough to address the economic conditions that might drive poor men to crime. The colonial system itself might be producing the kind of spiritual discontent that could lead even successful individuals to reject established society entirely. The records of his trial and execution were preserved in colonial archives, providing future historians with detailed documentation of both his crimes and his character. These documents revealed a man of genuine complexity who had struggled with questions that went to the heart of human existence in the New World. His case became a subject of study for legal scholars interested in how colonial justice dealt with crimes that crossed traditional social boundaries, while philosophers and social critics found in his story rich material for exploring the relationship between individual desire and social constraints. In the Caribbean islands, where piracy had flourished for more than a century, Stede Bonnet's name joined those of Henry Morgan, Bartholomew Roberts, and Edward Teach in the pantheon of legendary sea rovers who had challenged imperial authority and lived according to their own rules. But his story was unique among pirate legends because of the comfortable life he had abandoned to pursue his maritime rebellion, while other pirate captains had been driven to their careers by poverty, persecution, or the accidents of war and politics. The gentleman pirate had chosen his path freely, making his tale both more inspiring and more troubling to those who heard it. The plantation he had abandoned in Barbados eventually passed to his surviving family members, who worked to restore the respectability that Stede's actions had compromised. His wife Mary remarried, choosing a husband whose conventional nature promised none of the dangerous excitement that had characterized her first marriage. His children grew to adulthood, bearing a name that was both famous and infamous throughout the American colonies. Forced to navigate the complex legacy of a father who had become a legend through his rejection of everything they represented, The Revenge, the beautiful sloop that had carried Stede through his transformation from gentleman to pirate, was sold at auction by the colonial authorities and returned to legitimate commerce. Her new owners changed her name and removed the gun ports that had marked her as a vessel of war, attempting to erase all traces of her piratical career. But sailors who had known her during her brief but notorious service under the gentleman pirate's command continued to tell stories of her speed and beauty and of the remarkable man who had commanded her during those violent months when respectability and rebellion had sailed together under the black flag. In the end, Stede Bonnet's story became more than just another chapter in the history of Caribbean piracy. It became a meditation on the nature of freedom and authenticity in the New World, an exploration of what it meant to live according to one's own will in a society that demanded conformity to established patterns. His brief career as the gentleman pirate raised questions that would continue to resonate throughout American history, influencing generations of individuals who would face their own choices between security and adventure, between respectability and rebellion, between the safe paths laid out by society and the dangerous but potentially authentic alternatives that beckoned from beyond the horizon. The gentleman pirate had sailed into legend, leaving behind a wake of violence and philosophy that would continue to trouble the waters of American consciousness long after his ship had disappeared beneath the waves of history. In choosing piracy over plantation life, adventure over security, authentic experience over predetermined existence, Stede Bonnet had posed questions about the nature of American life that would echo through the centuries that followed his death. His story remained a reminder that even in the New World, with all its promises of opportunity and freedom, the tension between individual desire and social constraint could drive men to desperate measures in their search for meaning and authenticity. And so the gentleman pirate passed into history, his brief but remarkable career serving as both inspiration and warning to those who would face similar choices in the years to come. He had found in piracy something that eluded him in respectability, the sense of living fully and authentically according to his own will, rather than society's expectations. That he had paid for this authenticity with his life only added to the power of his legend, confirming that some prizes are worth any price, and that the search for genuine freedom sometimes demands the ultimate sacrifice from those brave or foolish enough to pursue it to its final destination.